Greetings. My name is Jared Easley. I'm one of the team members of Podcast Movement, and today we're excited to have John Kiernan here from Podbean. He is the head of marketing, and he's talking about using podcast ads to explode your podcast listenership. So, John, we really appreciate Podbean and the support that you guys have for the podcast community overall. And we're thrilled that you're going to join us today and share some of these insights. And so I'll go ahead and pass it over to you. And hopefully you can tell us a little bit more about Podbean for those that don't know, and a little bit more about yourself.
Of course. And I want to thank you again for giving us the opportunity to talk about podcast advertising here and really continue to spread the message of what we're looking to do here. For everybody who is currently in attendance here, I want to thank you for making the time in your days as well. I'm going to go ahead here and share a slide deck that I have. So once again, I want to thank you for spending your afternoon or morning or evening, wherever you're coming from, to learn a bit about how you can use podcast ads to explode your podcast listenership. So we're going to be talking here for about 40 minutes about some different strategies that you can think about for advertising your podcast on different podcasts to grow your audience. We're also going to take a brief trip to discuss different things that you can do that are a little bit outside of that. But we're going to be speaking for about 40 minutes or so, and I'd like to leave about 10 minutes at the end for any questions that you may have as well. I'll also be going through a demo of what we call Podbean's Ads Marketplace, which is where you can upload your ads to run ads on other podcasts. And inversely, you can accept ads to run on your podcast too. So as Jared said a little bit at the beginning here, just want to make sure we give a quick heads up as to who Podbean is and who we are. We've been a podcast host since 2006. And as of today, we're hosting over 560,000 hosted podcasts on our platform. We have 11 million episodes and 7 billion plus downloads. So we're always grateful for the podcasters that have chosen to choose us as their podcast host of choice. And when people think of podcast hosts, we think of you have this podcast, whether it's video or audio, and you want to do a lot with it. You want to monetize it. You want to promote it. You want to get it into more eyes and ears. Really, we give you the ability to do everything you could imagine with your podcast, from podcast live streaming, where you can receive donations, you can accept call-ins during your podcast live stream. You can monetize your podcast with premium podcasts, what we're going to speak about today, which is podcast advertising. There's a lot of different ways that you can do that. We also have a built-in patron program. We also offer enterprise solutions. So if you're looking to bring podcasting into the world of business, you have that option as well for a private internal communication solution. So really anything that you could want to do with a podcast, Podbean is going to give you, and already gives the way for you to do that. So before we get into podcast advertising, I like to take a quick trip back into thinking about ways that you can promote your podcast even without putting a dime into podcast promotion. Why do I say this? When we think about podcast advertising, we think about, first and foremost, we want to run ads on other people's podcasts, and in turn, they want to run ads on their podcasts. So thinking about ways to grow a listenership and to grow an audience is essential for both sides, because you may be a person who wants to advertise today, but you may be a person that wants to attract advertisers in the future. So first and foremost, the first thing I like to tell people is podcasting is a great medium, but don't be afraid to jump into different mediums to grow your audience as well. Number one, I like to use social media. Now, social media is one of the most important things for growing an audience for any brand, but especially for podcasting. You know, if we think about podcasting, a lot of the times it is just an audio or a video file, right, that people are able to listen to, whether it's for recreation, whether it's for business, whether it's to be the brand of your company, whatever the case may be. You are able to have a one-way interaction with your audience, but your audience may want to interact with you. They may want to ask follow-up questions, and they may want to help you spread your message. And that's where something like social media comes into play. You can leverage your social media for things that podcasting might not have the tool set for. Like, for example, you can create a Facebook discussion group, which is an extremely powerful tool to have people discuss about the topics that you discussed on your show. Let's say you discussed a big game. Let's say something big in the world happened and you discussed it on your podcast. There's no reason you can't use social media to discuss that and have your audience start their own conversations around your vision of it. Also, again, creating groups is a big thing for this. Now, secondarily, we want to think about podcast directories. Now, when we think about podcast directories, this is an app where podcasters can find, review, and listen to your show. And I put all of those things out there for a specific reason. When we talk about a podcast directory, the ads that you're going to run on other podcasts will more than likely also run on these different directories. So for example, if your podcast is set up to push to Spotify, to Apple Podcasts, unless those directories have a specific reason why they don't accept external ads dynamically inserted, or unless you have something worked out with them, your advertising can show up on those directories as well for your show. So making sure that you're on as many directories as possible is going to boost your vision. And on top of that, it's going to boost the advertising that you run. Also, don't ever rule out the idea of cross-promotion, the idea of promoting your services on another service's outlets and vice versa. This is something that I tell podcasters all the time, even before they put money into advertising. You have the ability to create a cross-promotional relationship with other brands and other podcasts, meaning that you can reach out to other podcasts or other brands with a press kit, with your website, and say, hey, I want to run advertising on your content, and in return, you can run on mine. Or let's say you're talking to another podcaster. You can say, hey, I'd like you to come on my show and promote your show and be part of our conversation, and vice versa. I'd like to come on your show, tell your audience what we're about, tell them about our show, and also dive in to your show as well, because that's another way that you can gain an audience, just like anything financial. And obviously, we're going to be speaking heavily here about podcast advertising. Once you have your podcast and your branding and all of that in line, then is the time to really start considering putting money into podcast advertising. And anybody that we have looked into over the last couple of years, any of the statistics that you can look up will showcase that podcast advertising, whether it's for a podcast or for a product, is extremely effective. About 88% of people are listening to every episode. And what does that mean? That means that if you have subscribers that are listening to a podcast, more than likely, they're not just listening to one episode, they're listening to the entire catalog. And this is especially true when podcast content is evergreen. When we think about content that can go out to our audience, we think about time-sensitive content and evergreen content. And just to touch on those, time-sensitive podcasts and time-sensitive content would be something more akin to, let's say, having a weekly program where you're covering the events and news of the week. Whereas evergreen content could be something that later on a podcast listener could come back to and get the same value weeks, months, and even sometimes years down the line. And when you think about podcast advertising, there's opportunities for you to run your advertising on both time-sensitive based podcasts and evergreen podcasts. Also, a lot of the advertising that's run on podcasts are often acted upon, whether that's an impulse buy, an impulse purchase, or even just checking out another podcast as we're discussing here. Because remember, the podcasting audience, as many of us are aware, is an extremely loyal fan base to those podcasts that they love. So if a podcaster is either running ads or speaking ads, which are called host read, we'll speak about those in a second, you have a high likelihood running advertising on a podcast for your show that you're going to have people coming back over and checking out the content that you're advertising. So just off statistics alone, podcast advertising in one form or another is extremely effective. And just to highlight a few things here, again, podcasters already listen to podcasts. Podcasting is an extremely engaging medium and an extremely feverish medium. You have a lot of podcasts who have a giant fan base. We see that with some of the most popular podcasts out there. So if a podcast host is speaking about a product that they are providing or that they're advertising, many times that podcast listener will act in some way on that content. The one thing I think that podcast advertising also has an advantage of is it's extremely easy for you to find your niche market. And whenever we talk about podcast advertising and we talk about how can I grow my podcasts quickly, we always talk about finding your specific niche market first. Maybe you're a sports-based podcast. Maybe you're a football-based podcast. But these are very general terms. If you're a podcast, let's say, that targets a specific town or a specific team, there may be deeper and more advertising opportunities for you because you're highlighting that specific niche of the market. And with podcast advertising, like you'll see using Ads Marketplace, you'll be able to actually add geolocation and find podcasts to advertise on that are based on a variety of different keywords. So you can really make sure that you're targeting your advertising to your most accepted listener that's going to most resonate with your advertising. When it comes to podcast advertising, also, you have a variable entry point when it comes to how much money you'd like to put into podcast advertising. You have many companies who will dive hundreds and thousands of dollars into advertising. You have podcasters who might have a limited budget, but in either way, you're in control of how much podcast advertising money you're going to put in to any campaign. And just so we know what a campaign is, really, a campaign is a certain amount of time that you're going to allot for a piece of marketing strategy. So if you're talking about a short-term campaign, maybe you're going to run advertising on a podcast for a month. You know, if you know that you're leading up to a big event and you want to gain a lot of eyes and traffic for that event, maybe it'll be a month's worth of time. If you're thinking that you want to consistently run advertising throughout the year just to get more eyes, not to a specific goal, but to your specific podcast, then you may think about how much money you're going to be putting in at that point. Also, again, even though we're talking about a paid opportunity here with podcast advertising, many of these advertisers want to speak to the people that they're running ads on. So it's another opportunity for you to develop these cross-promotional relationships with people that you might not have otherwise started these relationships with. Now, when we talk about cross-promotion and paid opportunities, I always like to kind of put it down the middle a little bit more as to what cross-promotional opportunities and paid opportunities both offer. And again, when we talk about cross-promotion, you often have a stronger bond sometimes with these advertisers, right? Or with these different podcasts. Again, we're all in this together, right? Because cross-promotional opportunities may not be paid only. It may be cross-promotional opportunities, which are simply that, which are simply promotional. A cross-promotional opportunity that's not paid, they may say, hey, we want to have you on our podcast, but you can come over to, or vice versa. We can come on your podcast, you can come on ours. And even though there's no money, the listener bases will be able to see a lot of results from the cross-promotional relationship. But when we speak about paid opportunities, it often adds to a deeper accountability of results, right? So you're saying to a podcast, I'm going to pay X amount of dollars to run my podcast on your show. Based on the numbers I've seen, based on the traffic that I've seen, I'm expecting this out of it. I'm expecting to see this much traffic come over to my podcast. So if you're paying for specific results, then more than likely that outlet is going to be incentivized to put in more work to get that content into eyes and ears also. And again, think about this. We talked about campaigns in the previous slide. Many campaigns may only be for a few weeks. It may be for a month. It may be for a few months. But the better a campaign goes, the more opportunities there may be to continue to advertise. If you're running advertising on a podcast and you're seeing a lot of traffic come back to your show, then the likelihood that you're going to reinvest in that show is much higher than if you're getting maybe a 10% increase of listenership by putting that much money in. Also, I often like to say that podcasters who have more of a planned future, meaning taking their podcast more as a business, a little bit more seriously, creating multiple pieces of content per month, those are the ones that will often look into this paid promotion, meaning that when you're looking to run advertising, these podcasts will say, oh, they're putting money behind their words. They're putting money behind what they want to push, meaning that you'll more than likely, with paid opportunities, be able to attract more serious podcasters. And in turn, these podcasters will see that you'll have more of a defined plan and goal to grow your audience, meaning again, that there could be more opportunities down the line for advertising. Again, there could be a lot of different ways that they could see your podcast as a little bit more professional also. So what do you need to advertise on a podcast? To make it very easy, you can just log into the ads marketplace, which we're going to, and we're going to get there. We're going to do a demo of that. But if you're not running ads using our ads marketplace, there's still a lot of items that you want to have at your disposal. First and foremost, you want to create what's called an ad copy. So basically, this is a script or a write-up that you can give to a host, and they can go ahead and read on their show. This is called a host-read ad. And many times, podcast hosts will like to, instead of running just an audio ad on their podcast, they like to read from a script. And because it adds a bit of a different flair, it adds a little bit of a different engagement. It's something that a podcaster may request. They may say, hey, do you have an ad copy that I can read on my show? And there is benefit to this. The benefit is, as I said, the podcaster can read it in their own voice, add their own flair, and deliver the information in their own way. But also having an audio ad, or if you're talking to a video podcast, having a video ad, these are things that you also want in your disposal so that you can give these to these podcasting hosts and say, you can do an ad copy, you can host read it on your show, or I already have a 15 to 30 second or 60 second, however long you decide that the advertising should be, ad that you can place directly in your show. Oftentimes, that's a great strategy if you have a specific visual or specific branding for audio, or a specific way that you need the advertising to land to get your message across. So these are two things that you absolutely need. Now, if you're looking to attract advertisers and you're looking to start sending emails, or you're starting to look at conventions and say, when I go to a podcasting convention, I'm going to take my podcast and ask for advertisers. These are very common strategies. One thing I will always say that is necessary is what we call a press kit. This is a finely tuned document that showcases your demographics, statistics about your show that you can give to these advertisers and potential companies and potential podcasters, to give them a great idea of what your listenership looks like, to give them a really defined picture of your listenership, your geolocation, your demographics, and everything that your show represents. Can you use a website? A website is a great solution that you can use as a press kit. I do not recommend using social media for this, though. Using social media, again, there's going to be a lot of stuff on social media that maybe an advertiser doesn't necessarily need to see, but your website can be a great solution for it. I would also recommend creating a PDF that you can email to different advertisers too. Again, PDFs are great. They can be printed out and they can be reviewed offline as well. If your website goes down for any reason, or it's down for maintenance and then it's going to come back up in an hour, you never know when that advertiser is going to look or that podcaster is going to access your content. So being able to email them a PDF press kit is always important. And as we talked about, consider your budget. How much are you going to look to spend on this campaign? With our platform, we have the model of CPM that you can look into. Many advertisers and many podcasters, especially if you're going down the road of manually reaching out to them via email, they may go ahead and ask for a flat fee. So think about the different amounts of money that you're willing to put in to podcast advertising. And then think about, if you're reaching out solo instead of using these other outlets, how you can work with a CPM model, meaning how many impressions, or meaning every 1,000 impressions, how much should a podcaster expect to get paid to run your advertising, or the flat fee. We're going to go ahead and pay you X amount of dollars for this month to run the ad on your show. Now, when you think about finding a podcast to run your advertising on, Much like your press kit, these are a lot of things that you'd want to include in your press kit. And these are considerations that you want to think of. So first and foremost, the podcast you're advertising on, how many downloads do they have a month? Not just on the episode, but overall in their entire catalog. We often think that a per episode listenership is a great statistic, which is, but remember, podcasts often have a myriad of different content that could span back months or years. And if they can run advertising on older content that's still getting a lot of traffic, that downloads per month across their entire catalog is extremely important. Also, think about the demographic and the reach that the podcast you're looking to advertise on. Again, let's use the sports podcast analogy. You may look at podcast advertisers and say, okay, I want to advertise on my niche market. But maybe you're just starting to get into podcast advertising and you say, you know what, I want to go ahead and advertise on a music-based podcast. Maybe that might not be the best focus for your podcast, even if the podcast has a lot of listenership. That talks about the branding of those podcasts. How much does it matter that you're running like content on like content? If the content, or rather I should say this, the more accurate the content is to the podcast that you're advertising on, the more likelihood you're going to receive that benefit back. So again, a sports podcast advertising on a music podcast might not be the best fit, but let's say a football podcast advertising on another sports podcast may definitely be up the line there. And then also thinking about their external demographics, right? Again, we're not just thinking about podcast advertising living just in the podcast sphere. How is their social media reach? This really touches more on the advertising if you're reaching out via email or more directly to these advertisers. How much of a reach do they have on their different outlets? You can ask things like, how large is your email campaign reach? You can ask things like this, your mailing list. This will also give you an idea of how far reaching your podcast advertising can go. And what is the easiest way to advertise your podcast? I've mentioned it a few times during our conversation here, but it is Podbean's Ads Marketplace. And we're going to go ahead and do a demo of the platform here shortly. But just in brief, if your podcast is hosted with Podbean, and this also, as I'm saying this, think that you can also accept advertisers to advertise on your podcast as well. So if you're looking to advertise your podcast on another podcast, you can go ahead and get extremely targeted advertising based on a variety of different conditions, geolocation, keywords, and all of these different pieces to make sure that your podcast is getting the most visibility possible. And our advertising platform is extremely quick. It's super easy, barely an inconvenience to set up. I think there's a lot of great things that you're going to see when we run through the demo here. As we talked about, when you're running advertising on podcasts, we do already have the statistics that showcase how effective it can be. And you can set daily budgets as well, meaning that you don't have to go into this already thinking that you have to spend thousands and thousands of dollars. You can have a budget that works best for you. And then as you're seeing here, we have a variety of statistics that you can see that you can check and see, okay, based on this podcast, how is my advertising running in these different time slots on these different shows? Right here, you may also see that it says pre, mid, and post. For those who aren't familiar with advertising or for podcasts yet, the pre, the mid, and the post refer to the different points in the podcast in which your ad can be run. The pre is at the beginning, the mid is somewhere in the middle of the podcast, and the post runs at the end. And there can be different price points that are accepted for these different placements as well. So let me go ahead here and stop sharing this screen, and I will share one more screen with our audience here. Okay, so now you should see my screen here that says manage your campaigns. So this is Podbean's Ads Marketplace. Now, when you start up your Ads Marketplace, we can go ahead and if you go to sponsorship.podbean.com, again, that's sponsorship.podbean.com. This is the website that you go to If you're with Podbean, you just have to create a separate username and password, and this is where you'll go to start running ads on other podcasts. And you can see here that I have a bunch of different advertisings that I've already run here. Now, I'm going to go ahead and click Create Campaign. And when I do this, it's going to ask me for a variety of conditions that I'm going to type in. I'm going to go ahead and type in a title, and I'm going to go ahead and type in a description. These are things that your podcast that you're looking to advertise on is going to see first. So in the description and the name, make sure that you're describing what the target audience is, who your organization is, and any details that are going to be useful about your campaign. For right now, I'm just going to copy and paste the name and description here. But again, when you're writing up your description, this may be a good time to use, for example, like the small one-sentence write-up that you have about your podcast. And then you can go ahead and put in your URL here. So let me do this. I'm going to use our website here. Now, under targeting, you're going to have the ability to geo-target as granular as possible here. You can have your advertising run worldwide, or you can select for your podcast to run in different markets. So for the USA, you can select any of the states that we have here. For the United Kingdom, you can select a city here. For Canada, and for Australia. And what's great here is for some of these, for example, if we did New York that we wanted to advertise in, we can even get more detailed if we choose to. Some of these will actually have a separate field that will get down to the city, not just the state. So for the purposes of this presentation here, we're going to go ahead and keep worldwide for now. We're going to scroll down here to our keyword section here. So this is going to go ahead and help our system choose some of the best podcasts that would be best for you to run your advertising on. So since we are a podcasting platform, we're going to do podcast, we're going to do podcasting, and let's say technology. So using these keywords, we're going to go ahead and get search results from Ads Marketplace, which will show us the best advertising, at least that the system thinks here too. And this will showcase here whether we want to run our ads in the pre, the mid, or the post roll here. I'm just going to go ahead and select pre-roll here. And it's going to ask us how much CPM we'd like to use. So it says here recommended is 20 to 30. So let's say we're going to do 20 CPM. So every time an advertisement is run, for every 1,000, that's going to be $20 that's paid to the podcaster. And then here's where you would type in your ad copy. So again, we're just going to do the title from above. But like it says here, remember what we talked about for the ad copy before. This is what's going to be presented to the podcasters. Now, with Ads Marketplace, you do need to have an MP3 file here. So we're going to go ahead and upload an MP3. I'm just going to choose a random MP3 from here. So let's do this. And usually we recommend anywhere from a 15 to 30 second advertisement. But again, it really depends on your advertising, as it says here for pre-roll and post-roll. Mid-roll oftentimes can be a bit longer. And then here's where we choose our daily cap. So this is going to say, how much do you want to spend on this campaign per day? And as it says here, once the daily cap is reached, your ads will stop appearing for that day, but then restart on the following day. So let's say I wanted to, per day, spend $10. And we wanted to start it today. Actually, not today. Let's say we wanted to start it in 2 days. And then we wanted to run it just until the 31st here. And then I'm going to click Select Podcasts. And you can run multiple campaigns simultaneously using this. So I'm just creating one campaign here. But what this allows you to do is you can run one campaign on one podcast and then run another campaign on another podcast here. So based on my keyword search, this is telling me what podcast would be the best to run my podcast on. And as you can see here, it's going to give me the monthly downloads across the channels here. It's going to say that based on my keywords, we have this podcast here. We have a variety of different pieces of content here. So if we wanted to, let's say, run on this podcast here and this podcast here, we can select multiple podcasts to run on the same time. But let's say we wanted to, for example, do the sports podcast like we talked about earlier. You see how it automatically changes the podcast that we can run on, or that it recommends, I'm sorry. So let's say we wanted to do Winnipeg sports. Then we can click save and continue here. Now, if we want to see a little bit more about a specific podcast, we can go ahead and click on that podcast and it'll tell us a bit more information. It'll allow us to listen to a couple of different episodes here so that we can really make sure that this podcast is going to fit what we want to run on. It's also going to give us their description. It's going to give us the top listened to countries in their market, and it's going to tell you the top 3 states in the USA that the podcast is listened to. It's also going to tell you about related podcasts that you can advertise on here too. And it's going to tell you about how many episodes they have, and they're going to tell you how long they've been around. Plus, it's going to tell you, as we talked about, the 13,000 downloads a month. So Winnipeg Sports Talk is doing some amazing work. And then what we would do is we would click save and continue here. Then you would authorize your payment. And once you've authorized your payment, you're off to the races to have this podcast advertising pushed to these different podcasts. Now, the podcaster can choose whether they want to run your advertising or not. There's 2 different kinds of ways that podcasts can have content on their podcast. Either they can manually review it, meaning that the content that gets sent to them, they can choose whether they want to run that specific advertising on their podcast or not, or they can have it automatically set up if the podcast advertising CPM matches what they've chosen. So, as you can see, I'm not going to go through the authorized payment section here, but as you can see, if you authorize the payment, you can be up and running with podcast advertising in only a couple of minutes here. And then if we click on My Campaigns, I might not have a campaign that I can showcase the analytics right now, but if we look at tracking here, if we look at this drop-down actions menu, we have 4 different options. We can stop our advertising from running. We can manage the podcast that the advertising is running on. We can edit the campaign to make sure it's a little bit more geo-targeted or to edit any information that we typed in previously. And we can look at the tracking here. So here it allows you to create a unique URL to direct podcast listeners to within the advertising. So there's a lot of different things that you have at your disposal with your podcast advertising campaign. So I'm going to go ahead and stop my screen share here. And I'm going to share one more screen. All right, perfect. This is the screen I should have gone to before I did the advertising. But as you can see here, there's only a few steps that you really need in order to get your advertising running. And I bring up the fact about not just you advertising on other podcasts, but you accepting advertising from other podcasts as well, because you may be at one point either one of these things. You may be the advertiser, you may be the podcaster who's looking to get that content on your podcast. So knowing what other people are going to see and knowing the other side of it can only help you in both of these different facilities here. Now, if we go to podbean.com/brands or sponsorship.podbean.com, as we talked about, these are the websites that you can go to start running your podcast advertising. Now, I also have my email here for if you do have any questions that don't get answered within this session here, or if you have a question that maybe a little bit later on you want to ask, feel free to email me at johnk@podbean.com. Down at the bottom, we have our social media handles, which are at Facebook at podbean.com, Twitter at podbean.com, and Instagram at podbean. So these social media channels were pretty interactive on all these different platforms. So again, if you do have any questions or you're seeing advertising success. You're seeing that your podcast is getting a lot of listens based on the advertising that you're running. Let us know. Deliver that feedback to us. We love hearing about that podcast experience. So again, please feel free to follow us on there and be sure to let us know how podcast advertising is working for you, or if you're looking to get into podcast advertising, we can assist you in any way possible. I'd like to go ahead and open it up for any questions that you may have at this time.
All right, let's see what we got here.
Sure.
I know we have a lot of people that are fans, and they're voicing their appreciation. Okay, this is from Betty. So I'll put this on the screen here. What are some of your suggestions on the data we should look into to optimize our advertisements on other podcasts? Thanks.
What are some suggestions on the data we should look into to optimize our advertisements on other podcasts? So based on what I'm seeing here, it looks like you want to run advertising on other podcasts, but how can you make it, for example, as attractive as possible? The first thing I would always do is make sure that your podcast advertising is succinct and as content driven as possible, meaning you don't need to speak any more about the content than you need to, right? You probably have a website, you have an entire podcast. With the advertising, keep it as succinct as possible. Do you want to let people know what you're about, let them know about the hosts, and let them know where they can find you? Let them know a little bit about your podcast. Some of the most effective ads are ones, for example, that people will have an engaging question maybe at the beginning, explain a little bit about what the hosts and what the show is about, and then they'll go into find us here, here, and here. And a lot of the times you can name 3 separate places. You can say, find us on Apple Podcasts, Podbean, Spotify, and anywhere you listen to podcasts. That way people know I can find you on all the different platforms, as we talked about with podcast directories. That would be one thing that I would recommend for you. And what are some suggestions on the data we should look into to optimize our advertisements on other ads? Again, also in terms of funneling in on who and where you should advertise, I would always say look at the specific demographics and downloads per month, as well as especially using Ads Marketplace where you can listen to the podcast. Make sure that the podcasts that you'd like to advertise on meet your specific market. There are benefits to doing this kind of shotgun marketing, meaning like just advertising on whatever podcast would accept you. But the most effective advertising is going to be that the advertising that's right in line with your current listenership and the listenership you're looking to build. So I hope that helps.
Absolutely. Okay. And Betty wanted to clarify. She said to clarify both content-wise and target podcast we chose or choose. Yeah. Okay. So let's see what Diane Romel, pardon me. She says, I'm still in the pre-launch stage of my podcast. It's about unique side hustles. And then she says, I don't have stats yet. How do I make an impact on those that I'm pitching my podcast to?
That is a fantastic question, and it speaks to the other side that we really didn't get to in this presentation here. So you have, let's say you're starting your podcast, right? You're creating this launch plan, and you're saying that you want to have advertisers maybe before you launch potentially, or soon to when you launch, right? You can still create that press kit, and you can still do this direct marketing to different advertisers. Using, again, Podbean's Ads Marketplace, you can select these podcasts who might want to run your advertising based on the amount of money you're putting in and based on your content here. Never shy away from numbers, and never shy away if you're starting up your podcast from letting advertisers know, hey, I'm starting up my brand new podcast. If you're using something like Ads Marketplace, consider how much money you want to put in to boosting the visibility before you launch. But you can have this pitch going on to your advertisers before you launch. You can let them know, hey, here's a one sheet of what my podcast is going to be about. Here's some of the hosts. Here's some of the things we've got in the pipeline. You'd be surprised how many advertisers, whether big or small, want to be part of podcasts who are just starting. The more professional you can make your presentation upon that first communication, the more likelihood that podcast host, or not the podcast host, the advertiser is going to want to work with you and vice versa. So I would say try to be as professional as possible with it. Write this kit up saying, hey, we want to go ahead and work with you, and make sure that you have all of your ducks in a row as much as possible. And these advertisers will want to work with you. But that's what makes the ads marketplace that much more powerful too. You don't need statistics immediately. With ads marketplace, you can just say, I want to put this much money into advertising, create that banger audio that we talked about before. And you can have that advertiser say, or that podcast say, come on and advertise with us for this duration of time.
Okay, we have another question. This one is from Linz. Lynn says, any suggestions on structuring your ad copy, particular elements you need to include, such as a call to action?
Sure. So again, another really good question. Everyone with the good questions today. When you're structuring your ad copy, I think of it very similarly to what we talked about a couple seconds ago here. When we think about really hitting the bullet points, right? I think that call to action with any sorts of marketing you do is extremely important too. So if you're keeping your ad copy concise down to, if you're reading your ad copy back to you and it feels like you're rambling, then try to cut it down a little bit more. The call to action is a great thing to do for sure. You don't want to have advertising that says, hey, here's what our podcast is about. Thanks. Because then no one knows where they can find you, right? If you have this ad copy going and you say, here's what our podcast is about, hit them with 2 or 3 really good sentences telling them about the podcast, then hit them with that call to action. And that could be the end of the ad copy. I think that's really effective. Again, make everything that you're saying as engaging as possible. If you're saying a sentence and you had content before, for example, I used to run a wrestling podcast, and we interviewed some bigger names in the industry. When we would run advertising, we would say, join us to hear exclusive interviews with Thunder Rosa, with all these different people. And they could just be 3 names or 3 big episodes we've done. That's what I would do. The first sentence can open up with, for example, here's what we talk about. This is, let's say the podcast is, we talk about, let's use the wrestling one, for example, because that's the closest thing here, right? Our podcast highlights the weekly shows going on in the world of wrestling. We've had interviews, or join us for exclusive interviews with names like Thunder Rosa and more. And then give them the call to action. Find us here, here, and here. Or find us on any of the podcast listening apps. I try to avoid saying listen on all of the podcast listening apps. I try to be directive to and add that at the end. Check us out on Apple, or search name of the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podbean, and anywhere you listen to podcasts, because just those small call to actions will be able to let people find you on those directories. And then when you say wherever you listen to podcasts, if it's not on there, people will be like, oh, that's the place to listen. But if you at least give that one target, then there's one place that you've given someone a call to go to. So great question.
This later on, and we have your email, which is John, JOHNK at podbean.com. We put that in the chat.
Yep.
John, as we start to close up here, do you have any final words of encouragement to podcasters that are kind of dipping their toes in this water? I mean, this presentation has been very thorough and very good. Just some parting words of wisdom would be amazing.
Absolutely. One thing I like to talk to podcasters all the time about is never think you're too big or too small to do anything. And it sounds very open. It sounds very broad. But again, podcast advertising is extremely effective. You have a podcast that you feel extremely passionate about. You may be in a topic that a lot of people are talking about, but it's your vision, it's your voice that people are going to resonate with, and how you present the information. So like I said, once you decide that, hey, I want to really get my podcast into more eyes and ears, there shouldn't be anything stopping you from reaching out to advertisers. Have the most professional presentation you can. There should be nothing stopping you from joining Ads Marketplace. Again, it's free to join. Once you start running the ads is when you get charged. And again, you don't need statistics to run on Ads Marketplace, right? You can just have your ad, you can have the content you want to push, and you would really be surprised what you can see. So jump in with both feet. Be as excited as you are about podcast advertising as much as you are about your podcast, because at the end of the day, you are promoting your podcast, you're promoting your message, and share that excitement with people. And the more excitement that you can share with people, especially even in the podcast advertising that you deliver, the more people are going to want to join and be part of what you do. So just get out there and do the best work that you can, just like you do with everything else you do.
Well said, John. We really appreciate your time. Thank you so much. One last thing, we did mention your email. You also shared the ad marketplace website. I hope people check that out. That's at podbean.com/brand. So, John, thank you again. And we appreciate everybody joining us and hope everybody has a great day. Thank you.
Thank you guys. Have a good one.